All right, so today I want to present a piece of my dissertation work, which is titled Institutional Overlap, Platform Rules, and Government Regulation. One disclaimer, I do intend to involve the practitioners in this presentation. I'm an assistant professor of strategy in business school, and we do want to kind of like involve the practitioner's knowledge, and if something doesn't make sense, so I want folks like David to speak out and be like, this doesn't make sense in the real world, and I want to know why, okay? Right, so to start off today, I would like to give a quick definition of two definitions of two things. The word institution is frequently mentioned in literature and also in public news. Here, I would like to define institution as a structure that governs the behavior of individuals and organizations. So think of Douglas North and also the more sociological definition of an institution, which is a rule or regulation that kind of like constrains opportunism and facilitates exchange in the market. Right. And the second concept might be more foreign to most of us, which is the institutional constituent. In this case, I am defining a constituent as basically a supporter of an institution. So the government is oftentimes cited as a constituent, an important constituent that supports and enforces an institution. A couple of quick examples right here. You'll see that, who knows what the upper left quadrant is? The upper left quadrant right here. Does anyone know what that is? It's the Code of Hammurabi. It's the Code of Hammurabi all the way from ancient Babylon. And in that case, that is the institution. Those are the laws that govern people's behavior. In terms of constituent, that will be the king living in the hanging gardens. A more modern example would be GDPR, a very famous set of internet data laws implemented in Europe, and the constituent of that institution will be the European Parliament in Brussels, in Belgium. Okay, so I hope these two kind of examples showcase what I mean by an institution and what I mean by an institutional constituent. So let's move on. A theoretical puzzle for everyone right here. This is a puzzle, a game that everyone can get by. If you are an economist, if you're a sociologist, if you're a practitioner, if you're a lawyer, if you are an engineer, you can all get involved. So I'm going to point to my friend John right here. By the way, John is one of the most interesting people I've ever met. So John is a lawyer, but imagine John is the head of a pharmaceutical company. John is trying to develop a new drug to implement in the market. But in the process of developing this drug, John faces institutional pressures from various constituents. So John, on one hand, faces a lot of pressure from scientific committees and organizations out there that tell John to be more scientific in his process. I got to be very scientific, very meticulous with my measurements, with my instruments and everything. So that's one source of pressure. And John faces pressure from the government. Governments care about compliance. You got to abide by all the laws, all the laws out there. You cannot violate certain laws implemented by the government. And lastly, John faces conformity pressure from environmental activist groups. So environmental agencies or activists would force John to not waste resources or be kind toward animals. So don't use animals in your kind of like experiment process. So these are all the various sources, constituents that exert different pressure, kind of like pulling John apart in different directions. So a lot of the research in organizational theory and also in strategy talks about how John deals with this kind of situation in which there's a lot of complexity associated with different constituents are exerting different pressure on John. So you can kind of like manage them by playing one against the other or just feigning your conformity with one constituent while really listening to the other. So this is a situation called institutional complexity. Now, what is less talked about in my field and also in other fields will be the situation of what I call institutional overlap. In the sense that John right now is facing several players, several constituents who are exerting the same pressure to John. In this case, they all want John to be very scientific in his approach. So you might be asking, why is this interesting? If you have more players pushing you, more constituents pushing you to be more scientific, then naturally I feel more conformity pressures to be more scientific. This is not interesting at all. But if you think about it, if one of these players is very, very different from the other, say if one of these players is Donald Trump, and all of a sudden Donald Trump comes into the room and be like, John, you gotta be really scientific in your approach. I am the #1 expert in science, and I am going to enforce this. But sometimes you might think, hey, his threat is not very believable because I don't think he knows anything about science. So maybe there's a chance that, no, if I don't conform to this rule, then I'll be okay. He'll never find out. So that's a puzzle right here. The institution overlap fundamentally points to the difference between having one constituent seeking conformity and having have the support of additional constituents, whether that actually translates into more conformity pressure on the part of the market actor. So if I were to summarize my research question, the theoretical puzzle I'm trying to explore here is how do market actors respond to institutional overlap? Okay? This is a concrete example. I am talking about government regulations of digital platforms. So basically, the idea is that nowadays there are all these issues surrounding the government regulations and also platform rules, whether the platforms are able to kind of effectively manage the market environments. Now, in the top example, you can see Mark Zuckerberg is responding to calls in the Senate, and a lot of these senators are asking questions like, what is data, or how does Facebook make money if it's free? And lower left right here, Ethereum, one of the platforms got hacked, right? Actually, I was one of the victims. I put in $2,000, which should be worth $40K right now, but it's all gone. So how, in these situations, essential question a lot of people are asking is, should the government intervene? Should the government put itself on these platforms and be like, oh, if you're violating the platform rules, you're also liable for government laws. You're also violating government laws. So that's the kind of question I'm looking at. Bottom right, by the way, is these are the fake products or counterfeit products on Chinese platforms, a lot of e-commerce platforms. So let me give you more concrete, some more concrete theory, more concrete examples right here. So increasingly, from today's presentations and yesterday's presentations, we're seeing that a lot of these laws and rules can be both implemented by the government and by the platform. So there is significant amount of overlap in terms of institutional demands and pressure from these two actors: the public constituent, which is the government, and the private constituent, which is the platform. Okay, so in the popular media, we'll see sources like Wired, Conversation, Financial Times are urging the government to step in a lot of these platform affairs, and arguing that we do need to regulate the tech platforms, and we must regulate social media before it's too late. And actually, one of the articles published in the Pennsylvania Regulatory Review argues for the case of co-regulation, where the government should be actively stepping in and putting its name on all the platform rules. So if eBay or Amazon has a rule that regulates against counterfeits, the government should put its name on there and be like, oh, you're facing prison sentence if you don't abide by these rules. So basically, my question is going to be asking if this is something that will work, and under what conditions is such a strategy of co-regulation would be effective. All right. So I'm going to quickly skip over. I think you're getting my idea. I don't want to repeat myself. Institutional overlap is when both the government and the platform are pushing for the same demand. All right, and more specifically, the context is the Chinese government and also the e-commerce market. So when we think of the Chinese government and also digital platforms, you oftentimes think of censorship. And this presentation, this research is not about censorship. Rather, it's about consumer rights protection. So in the case of counterfeit products. All right. So some of the things the Chinese government did in the past to ensure, to enhance consumer rights protection is working with these platforms to crack down on counterfeit book goods, and produce these 5-year plans to develop the standardized regulation for platforms in the 13th 5-year plan. So more specific research question to my overall research question, which is how do market actors respond to institutional overlap, is defined as in the interaction between the platform regulation and government regulation. All right, let me quickly go through my hypotheses because I don't have too much time. I have 15 minutes, right? Okay, cool.
You still actually have 17 minutes.
Oh, very nice. Okay, I can spend more time then. Good. Okay. I understand a lot of economists in the room, but in institutional theory and organization science, there is a strand of research on private regulation. Almost all of this research is based in the United States. Right? An example I can give is nuclear energy. In the U.S., a lot of nuclear power plants are regulated both by government and by a private association called INPO. So basically, this private association would talk to the government and get some sort of extended authority, and saying that although we cannot sentence you to prison if you are the head of this nuclear power plant and you're not abiding by the law, but we can report you to the government and showing them that you're violating the law of the government, and therefore they can sentence you to prison. And we can also punish you. This private organization can also punish you by kind of forcing you to close down for a period of time or by fining you. So this is a prime example of how a private association, the regulatory body, can work with the government in order to ensure that these nuclear power plants are in order. So that's just one example of how private regulation actually combines with government regulations to ensure compliance. So I'm just going to quickly kind of state my baseline hypothesis, which is relative to platform-only rules. So without government regulation at all, platform rules with government regulations will be associated with lower rate of transgression or lower tendency toward transgression among the complementers or the sellers. So I'm agnostic as to which level it is. So basically, the context here is that you have a platform rule. A platform can announce a rule to all its complementers, all its sellers, whether you mention the role of the government at all in that rule. Right. So just to let you know ahead of time, it will be like a central government rule, like a kind of like the central government law that I will be using to kind of differentiate different treatment groups. Okay. So again, the baseline hypothesis that you have one set of rules without government regulation and one set of rules with government regulations. The ones with government regulations will be more effective. That's basically the first hypothesis. So if I were to draw this down as a set of graphs, you'll see that there is a negative relationship I'm hypothesizing between government regulation in the platform rule and the level of seller transgression or misbehavior. Okay, so that's the baseline hypothesis. Move on, something more interesting, which is really the core of this paper, is I am looking at the details, the amount of details in the rule. So a rule can be highly detailed or extremely simplistic. It can be one sentence rule or it can be 10 paragraphs, right? The idea here is that when facing a rule that's very detailed, the amount of details are likely to highlight or activate in the mind of the seller something about the government. Like they use a lot of mental models or heuristics or stereotypes to think about government. And these negative perceptions of governments will be highlighted if the rule is very long, very detailed. So if I were to ask you, sorry if I'm offending people from the government or in this room, but a lot of the most common stereotypes and perceptions associated with the government is inefficiency and incompetency, right? Especially when it relates to technology. So the argument here is that you have a very detailed rule. It's going to make the sellers think that there's no way the government can implement such a detailed rule. Versus when you have a very simple rule, that kind of perceptions don't get activated. So here these arguments were venturing into the field of social psychology and like perception and cognition here. In other words, the second hypothesis I'm proposing is going to be a moderating effect. So we argue in the first hypothesis that government regulation in platform rule will be beneficial, will be reducing transgression or reducing misbehavior. But this effect will be hampered. This effect will be dampened if you have a lot of details in the rule. So basically, that's the setup of this paper, quite simple. Whether these regulations are applying to the platform or to the sellers or both. Right, I think that would matter, but in this case, I'm talking about regulating the sellers. So sellers do a lot of misbehavior or transgression, acts of transgression on the platform context. In this case, I'm talking about counterfeit products, but they can steal customer data. That's also a form of transgression. So you want to curb the level of transgression on the platform, and both the platform and the government can do that. So in this case, I'm talking about only the sellers. We're targeting the sellers. So basically, to simplify this, it's a survey experiment. Basically, I found these 3,000 Chinese e-commerce sellers and sent surveys to them. And each of these surveys has a different storyline, has a different rule that is shown to each of these e-commerce sellers. And then the idea is to measure their response in terms of their transgression tendency, or whether the likelihood of violating the rule based on their response. So in this case, you have 6 vignettes. A vignette is basically a storyline. In this case, a platform rule description. And you'll see here that they're varying across 2 different dimensions. One is whether they have this government regulation, and the other is the amount of details. Previously, I said complexity. The amount of complexity in the rule. Just to quickly show you what I mean, the first level of treatment is very simple to understand, with versus without government regulations here. So in this context, I'm talking about like the seed and flower market. If you're a Taobao seller selling seeds and flowers, on the top, this rule actually mentions the seed and flower law of the PRC. And these acts are against the government's laws. So basically, that's the difference. And in the case without government regulations, it doesn't mention anything about government at all, and only talks about against platform regulations here. So that's a key difference. That's the first treatment. And second layer of treatments, here you see that this is a rule that contains a lot of details. So before, these rules are simple rules, very simple, kind of like one sentence and just have the 3 different criteria. Here is a very detailed rule. Basically, they're saying the same thing, but they're giving more examples using real people. Like Ming just sold a batch of 200 rose seeds. Lil Chen just sold a bouquet of pink roses. So these are examples, kind of like very descriptive details they add into the variations. All right, so this is how it plays out, how the experiment was given out on the computer. So when they answer a survey, they see something like that. So basically, the sentence is priming the respondents to imagine like a hypothetical situation. This is the rule, the platform rule they read, and there are 6 versions of this. And you click next page to answer questions on misbehavior, to gauge their level of tendency toward misbehavior. And the misbehavior or transgression is measured in this. So basically, you see choice A right here, whether it's asking you whether it's okay to substitute yuezhi seeds for rose seeds, which is a lot cheaper. So that's actually something a lot of sellers do, is to substitute these seeds of a different kind for rose seeds, which are a lot more expensive. And the second option you see here is you substitute 1 seed for every 10 seeds. Not as bad, but it's still bad. It's still misbehavior. And the third option is selling subpar quality, the seeds that are not going to blossom. And the fourth one you can see here is advertising for something that don't exist, like blue roses. There are no blue roses in the world. They're artificially dyed. So these are all different forms of transgression or misbehavior. And the idea of this question is to measure their tendency toward it, and while varying the different vignettes or experimental settings. Okay, so I'm going to show the results real quick. I have 3 minutes. Results. All right, I'm going to talk to John right here. These are numbers, but not models, right? Okay, so basically what you see here is on the right-hand side, you have, this is a rule with government regulation. And on the left-hand side, this is a rule without government regulation. On the y-axis, this is misbehavior or non-compliance and transgression. This is bad. Higher bar means bad. Lower bar means better. So you can see that in the cases of with government regulation, the platform rule, overall it's better. And the difference is 28% in terms of odds or tendency toward misbehavior. So basically, a key message is that government regulation in the platform rule, overall, it leads to less transgression. It's beneficial. Right? That's the overall results, very simple results. But, okay, that's the regression table. So John, you can close your eyes right now. But basically, the difference is the effect size is 28% in terms of odds of transgression, odds of misbehavior. Okay, the secondary effect, the moderating effect right here, this is more complicated. But you'll see that the red line is without government regulations. On the right-hand side right here, you can see is high details. If the rule contains a lot of details, the effect is reversed, meaning that for very detailed rules, it's actually more beneficial to not have the government's presence or government involvement in the platform rule, right? So in other words, rule details dampen the benefits of government regulations. So for highly detailed rules, it's actually better to not have the government involved in platform regulation. That's the key message. All right. Quick couple words on implications. So theoretically, I don't want to talk too much, but the notion of institutional overlap, I guess, understudied in my field at least. So we'd love to hear how the economists think about this, but it's very understudied in my field. But in terms of practical knowledge, I am outlining a new approach toward platform regulation. So basically, I am presenting a set of conditions under which a platform should versus should not purposefully involve the role of the government or kind of reveal the role of the government in its private regulation. So that marks the end of the presentation. Looking forward to talking more. Thank you.